It was Louisiana, 1887. The swamps lay heavy with mist, the cypress trees bending under their own dripping moss, and the old plantation houses sat like rotting monuments to a world that refused to die. In that year, a single rumor spread from the parish towns into New Orleans, a story that began in whispers and ended in silence. A widow, wealthy beyond measure, had opened the doors of her sprawling manor to strangers. She promised them warmth, food, and a roof against the endless storms that lashed the bayou. Travelers spoke of her charm, her refinement, the way her pale hands seemed to linger just a little too long when pouring wine. Many accepted her hospitality, but what she did with their bodies left everyone silent. The locals still lower their voices when they speak her name, and some refuse to speak it at all. What you're about to hear is not a ghost story. It is not even just a crime. It is something that settled into the bones of the swamp itself, something that turned hospitality into horror. Before we uncover the disturbing truth of the widow of Hollow Manor, take a moment to subscribe, strike the bell, and tell us in the comments which state you're watching from. Because by the end, you'll want to remember exactly where you were when you heard this story. The widow was called Isolde Bellerose, a name as delicate and fragile as porcelain, though the people of the parish swore she had ice in her veins. Left alone after the death of her husband, she maintained the grand estate on the edge of the bayou with quiet dignity. She hosted gatherings for politicians, clergymen, and drifters alike. No one was ever turned away, and yet one by one those who crossed her gates were never seen again. Her house became known as the last stop, before the swamp swallowed you whole. Some said she ran a boarding house. Others claimed it was more like a trap, a gilded cage where you entered alive and left only in whispers of rumor. What investigators would later uncover inside her home would shake Louisiana to its core. But before that night of reckoning, before the shocking discovery of her hidden chambers, the parish was lulled into a false security that a lady of grace and breeding could never be capable of such horrors. They were wrong, and the first clue came in the form of a letter, slipped beneath the church doors on a rain-washed morning, written by a traveler who had vanished 2 weeks prior. His words were shaky, hurried, as though the ink itself trembled in fear. Do not go to Hollow Manor. She is not what she seems. She drinks more than wine. And the walls are listening. What those words meant and how they led to the unraveling of the widow's secret is where our story begins. Isolde Bellerose was the kind of woman who could silence a room with her entrance. Born to a French family that had prospered on the backs of cotton and sugar, she had grown up with wealth pressed into her palms like an inheritance of iron. When her husband, Auguste Bellerose, died suddenly in 1884, the parish whispered it was consumption. Others suggested poison. Either way, no physician was permitted to examine the body. The casket was sealed, and Isolde wore her mourning veil with such perfection that no one dared question her grief. Yet only weeks later, the Bellerose estate opened its doors again. A light glowed from the tall windows each night, and music drifted into the swamp air. The widow entertained clergymen, merchants, even weary travelers passing through. No soul shall be turned away, she often said, her voice soft as velvet. To the townsfolk, her generosity was a blessing. To the desperate, it was a salvation. But inside Hollow Manor, the atmosphere was different. Guests described her charm as intoxicating, her pale face always lit by candlelight, her voice carrying a weight of secrets. She had a way of asking questions no one wanted to answer, lingering on the private details of her guests' lives as if memorizing them for later. The first to vanish was a traveling salesman named Peter Lemaire. He had come down from Baton Rouge selling pocket watches and silver brooches. His last known stop was Hollow Manor, where he reportedly dined with the widow in a room filled with candelabras. His wagon was found days later, abandoned on the muddy road with the horses still tethered. His belongings remained, but Peter himself was gone. Isolde explained it away with ease. He left in the night, she told the sheriff, her hands folded gracefully. Perhaps he grew restless, as men do. No one challenged her. After all, who would accuse a widow cloaked in sorrow and dignity of such a thing? But behind her walls, things stirred. Neighbors claimed they heard sounds after midnight, a dragging across the floorboards, a thud that shook the walls, and once, a scream so faint it could have been mistaken for the cry of a night heron. Those who lived closest said the manor seemed to breathe, exhaling damp air through its shutters, inhaling the fog that clung to the swamp. Weeks passed. More strangers disappeared. A seamstress from Mobile, a preacher traveling north, a young man searching for work. Each time the widow gave the same explanation. They had left in the night, restless spirits gone before dawn. But the truth was far darker. Later accounts describe the widow's eyes as bottomless, her smile too still, as if practiced in a mirror. She did not blink the way other women blinked, one surviving witness recalled decades later. She looked at you as though she were already imagining your body on her table. That table, investigators would later discover, was not made for dining, and the first clue to its existence would be uncovered not by lawmen, but by a child who wandered too close to the manor's open cellar doors one evening and came running home pale as bone. He claimed he saw Peter's silver watch lying in the dirt, and next to it, a single blood-soaked glove. The boy who made the discovery was only 9 years old, the son of a fisherman who lived along the edge of the bayou. He had been chasing a frog through the reeds when he stumbled upon the open cellar doors of Hollow Manor. The smell hit him first, damp, metallic, like wet iron. Inside, half hidden in the shadows, he spotted something that should not have been there. A man's glove, soaked through as if it had been dipped in dark water. And beside it, catching the dim light from the swamp, a silver watch. The boy's scream carried across the marsh, bringing his father running. When the fisherman arrived, he found nothing but the open cellar and his son trembling. The glove and watch were gone. By sundown, the story had spread through the parish. The widow dismissed it with a gentle laugh, claiming the boy's imagination had run wild. "Children see ghosts where there are only shadows," she said softly, pouring tea for the reverend and his wife. And yet, no one could ignore the way her hands lingered on the teapot, white knuckles pressed against porcelain, as if she were holding something back. Whispers grew louder. At the church steps, men muttered that the Bellerose woman kept her wine cellars too well stocked for a widow who rarely drank. Women shook their heads and spoke of the endless shipments that arrived at the manor, crates carried inside by hired men who never returned. And then came the knock at the sheriff's door. It was a farmer from the outskirts, pale and shaken. He had been hunting wild pigs when he strayed too close to Hollow Manor. He swore he saw lanterns flickering in the basement windows well past midnight, though no servant had been seen entering or leaving the estate in weeks. "Someone's down there," he told the sheriff. Not just her. The sheriff, a man named Claude Verret, was reluctant. He owed debts to the Bellerose family, debts of honor and coin alike. He had no desire to cross his oldie, but the pressure mounted. Mothers forbade their children to wander near the swamp road. Travelers stopped seeking shelter. Even the church bells seemed to toll with unease. Finally, Verret agreed to visit Hollow Manor. He arrived on a mist-thick evening, lantern in hand, and was greeted by Isolde herself. She wore a gown of deep black, her hair pulled into a severe knot, her face pale against the flickering light. "Sheriff," she said smoothly, her voice a gentle lull, "have you come to accuse a lonely woman of phantoms?" Verret cleared his throat, uneasy. He searched the manor, the parlors, the dining hall, the bedrooms hung with lace curtains. Each room was immaculate. The scent of roses lingered in the air. Nothing seemed amiss. But when he asked to see the cellars, the widow's smile faltered, only for a moment. Then, with a graceful sweep of her hand, she led him down the stone steps. The cellar was lined with wine racks, bottles stacked in endless rows. The walls dripped with condensation, the air cool and heavy. At first glance, nothing was wrong, nothing except the silence. Verret lifted his lantern higher. Shadows stretched long against the walls. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw something shift. Not a rat, not the flicker of flame, but something larger, something that withdrew into the dark. "Are you satisfied?" Isolde asked, her voice cutting through the damp air. The sheriff nodded, though unease clung to him as he left. And as he stepped back into the night, he swore he heard it, faint, muffled, almost drowned by the hum of the swamp, a voice, calling from beneath the earth. That night, he said nothing. But the memory of that sound would haunt him until the day Hollow Manor gave up its dead. The sheriff's silence did little to calm the parish. In fact, it only made the whispers sharper, darker. If Claude Verret had found nothing in Hollow Manor, why did he look so pale when he emerged? Why did his lantern shake as though gripped by a trembling hand? The people of the parish began to speak of rituals. Some claimed that on moonless nights a red glow could be seen behind the manor's shutters, like firelight flickering against lace. Others swore that they heard singing, low droning chants that carried across the swamp, too measured to be prayer, too mournful to be song. The church tried to silence the talk, but the bayou has always belonged more to shadows than to scripture, and shadows were gathering thick around Isolde Bellerose. Then came another disappearance. This time it was Elias Carter, a carpenter from across the parish. Known for his strength and honesty, Elias had been hired to repair the sagging beams in the widow's east wing. He kissed his wife on the cheek before setting off with his tools in a burlap sack. She never saw him again. When his wife came to Hollow Manor searching, Isolde greeted her with soft sympathy. He worked one day, she explained, but left before dawn. He said he was needed elsewhere. Her voice carried the weight of sorrow, her hands resting lightly on the woman's shoulders. And yet the wife noticed something strange, a single splinter of wood caught in the folds of Isolde's gown. By dusk, the swamp seemed restless. Dogs barked toward the manor and would not be silenced. The fishermen refused to set their nets near its shadow. Travelers turned away at the gates, choosing instead to risk the wilds of the marsh. Hollow Manor had become a place spoken of only with lowered voices. Sheriff Verrett could no longer ignore the signs. He returned to the cellar days later, unannounced this time. He pried open the doors himself and descended into the damp darkness. The air felt heavier than before, clinging to his skin like wet cloth. He raised his lantern high, scanning the wine racks. At first nothing seemed amiss, but then he noticed the dust. Rows upon rows of bottles stood untouched, coated thick in years of neglect. And yet Isolde's shipments arrived regularly. So where had the wine gone? He pressed his ear to the back wall, a smooth surface of stone and mortar. That was when he heard it again. A sound, a faint tapping, as though knuckles brushed against stone from the other side. Verrett's blood turned cold. He staggered back, his lantern swinging, throwing grotesque shadows against the cellar walls. He fled up the steps, slamming the doors shut behind him, his heart pounding like a drum. The sheriff told no one of what he heard that night. But from that day forward, he began carrying a pistol strapped beneath his coat, and he never again looked the widow in the eyes. Outside, the swamp seemed to close in tighter around Hollow Manor. The reeds swayed without wind. The cypress trees leaned as if listening, and those who dared pass by swore they saw faces in the windows. Pale, gaunt faces pressed against the glass, staring out with hollow eyes. Elias Carter's wife would not stop searching. She returned to the manor again and again, knocking at the gates, begging for her husband's return. One evening she left an offering at the steps, a small wooden cross carved by Elias himself. The next morning it was gone. In its place was a stain upon the stone, dark, wet, and spreading outward like a flower. The parish could no longer look away. Rumors gave way to fear. Fear gave way to rage. And soon a small group of men began whispering of torches and iron, of ending Hollow Manor before its darkness spread further. What they didn't know was that Isolde had been waiting for exactly that. It was a sweltering August night when the parish men gathered at the church steps. They carried lanterns, pitchforks, a rusted musket or two. Their voices were low, hushed by the weight of what they intended to do. No one spoke Isolde's name aloud. To name her was to invite her. They simply said, "Tonight, we end it." Sheriff Verrett refused to join them. He sat in his office, sweating beneath his hat, staring at the pistol on his desk. He knew what lived beneath Hollow Manor, but he feared it more than he feared the wrath of his neighbors. "Don't go," he muttered when they came to call on him. "She will be waiting," but the men ignored him. They were tired of silence, tired of missing sons and fathers. They wanted answers. By midnight, a dozen men crossed the swamp road toward Hollow Manor. The fog lay thick, curling around their boots. The reeds whispered like conspirators. In the distance, the manor loomed, its windows glowing faintly as though lit from within by something other than fire. They approached the gates but found them standing wide open, as if they had been expected. Inside, the air was heavy with roses. Too heavy. Sweetness cloyed in their throats until it tasted almost like rot. They lit their torches and fanned out across the parlor, their boots echoing on the marble floor. The house seemed alive. Shadows stretched unnaturally long. Curtains stirred with no breeze. And always, that scent of roses so thick it felt like the flowers had been steeped in blood. At the far end of the parlor, Isolde appeared. She wore a gown of deep crimson, her hair flowing loose down her shoulders. She looked at the men not with fear, but with calm amusement. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying like silk across the vast room, "have you come to pay your respects?" The men raised their torches higher, their hands trembling. One stepped forward, demanding the truth of Elias Carter, of Peter Lemaire, of all who had vanished. Isolde only smiled. "They are still here," she whispered. "Would you like to see them?" Before they could respond, she turned and moved toward the cellar doors. Lantern light glinted against the iron hinges as she pulled them open. A breath of cold air rose up, damp and metallic. The men followed, though every step downward felt like descending into a grave. The torches sputtered as the air grew thick. The scent of roses gave way to something else now, iron and decay. And then they saw it. The cellar stretched wider than they had ever known, the stone walls opening into chambers carved deep into the earth. Along those walls hung shapes, human shapes, their flesh pale, their bodies suspended on iron hooks. Some were fresh, some were not. Their eyes were gone, their mouths frozen in silent screams. On a central table, polished like an altar, lay Elias Carter. His chest had been opened, his heart gone. In its place, nestled neatly inside the hollow cavity, was a cluster of roses blooming red against his white skin. The men staggered back, their torches trembling, their voices failing. One dropped his lantern, and it shattered on the stone. The widow turned to them, her pale face illuminated by the guttering light. "They are not dead," she said softly. "They are eternal. The body is but soil, and soil must be fed." Her words wrapped around them like a noose. The men fled, scrambling up the stairs, stumbling into the swamp with terror choking them. Not all made it back. Those who survived would never again speak of what they saw that night. But the parish changed. Doors were bolted, curtains drawn, and Hollow Manor stood untouched, glowing faintly through the fog, like a lantern in a graveyard. For the widow had shown her first truth, and it was only the beginning. The men who escaped Hollow Manor that night did not return to their homes as they left them. They stumbled into the parish like shadows of themselves, faces drained, hands shaking, eyes wide and unblinking. They tried to drink the fear away in the tavern, but their cups never reached their lips. They tried to pray it away in the church, but their voices cracked before the words left their throats. One of them, Jacques Moreau, a farmer, broke first. Days after the descent into the cellar, he collapsed in the aisle of the chapel, muttering to himself until the priest bent low to hear. His confessions spilled out in ragged breaths, a torrent of horror that left the priest pale as wax. "She plants roses in them," Jacques whispered, clawing at the air as though reaching for unseen faces. "She says it keeps their souls." I saw Ios. He was still warm, His voice broke into sobs, the sound echoing in the vaulted chapel until the congregation outside fell silent. Word spread quickly. Parish women gathered at the pump, clutching their children close. Men muttered at the blacksmith shop, sharpening tools not for work but for defense. The name Bellerose no longer carried respect, it carried dread. And yet the church hesitated. The priest, shaken by Jacques' words, called for prayer, for patience. "We must not leap to judgment," he told them, his voice quivering. "Accusation without proof is damnation." But his eyes betrayed him. He knew, they all knew. Sheriff Verrett, meanwhile, drank himself deeper into silence. He had seen enough in the cellar to damn him for eternity. But debt chained his tongue. And fear of what lay beneath that manor, made him cowardly. Still, something shifted in the air of the parish. Night brought no rest. Windows rattled though no storm passed. Dogs whined at shadows. Children claimed to see a woman in black gliding past the cypress trees, her gown trailing mist, her pale hand brushing their windowsills. And then came the knock at the rectory door. It was a woman, Claire Carter, Elias's wife. Her face was sunken, her eyes raw from sleepless nights. She carried something in her hands wrapped in a cloth. When she unwrapped it, the priest recoiled. It was Elias's ring, a simple band of brass, crusted now with dried blood. "I found it on my doorstep this morning," she whispered. I heard her voice in the night. She said he belongs to her now, that he blooms eternal. The priest could no longer deny it. Hollow Manor was no longer rumor. It was sacrilege. But the widow was untouchable. Wealth shielded her. Fear protected her. And the sheriff himself had turned away from the truth. The church dared not move against her openly. So a decision was made in whispers, carried from pew to pew, from house to house. They would gather proof, not tales, not rumors, but proof that could not be denied. And so one storm-thick evening, two men set out across the swamp with lanterns and shovels. They did not go to confront the widow. Not yet. They went searching for her gardens. For it was said that the roses of Hollow Manor bloomed brightest where no roses should grow. And if the stories were true, the soil beneath those blossoms would hold the proof they sought. What they unearthed that night, beneath the roots of her roses, would unravel everything the parish thought they knew about life and death. The storm rolled heavy across the bayou that night, lightning splitting the sky into jagged wounds of white. Two men trudged through the reeds toward Hollow Manor, their lanterns shivering in the wind. They carried shovels, and though they said nothing to one another, their silence was weighted by a single thought: the roses. The widow's gardens were infamous. Even in the dead heat of summer, when other flowers wilted under the swamp's breath, hers bloomed red and lush, their petals soft as velvet, their fragrance thick as wine. Some swore they grew taller with each disappearance. Others claimed they pulsed faintly at night, as though drinking something richer than rain. The men reached the iron gates slick with rust and rainwater, and slipped inside. The manor loomed in the distance, windows dark, its silhouette jagged against the storm. But they did not go to the house. They went straight for the gardens, lightning flared overhead, throwing the roses into brief, brilliant relief. Their blossoms glistened wet in the storm, drooping under the weight of water. The men raised their shovels and began to dig. The earth was soft, too soft, as though it had been turned often. The smell rose first, not the clean musk of wet soil, but something sour, metallic, sweet all at once, something that clung to the back of the throat. After only a few strokes, the first shovel struck something solid, a dull thunk. They dug faster, hearts pounding, lanterns casting wild shadows. And then it emerged, a hand, pale, half-rotted, fingers tangled with roots that seemed to grow through the flesh itself. The roses above swayed as if disturbed, their stems trembling though no wind touched them. The men staggered back, retching, but they forced themselves to continue. Soon more shapes emerged, limbs bent unnaturally, faces twisted in silent agony, bodies planted upright beneath the soil like grotesque scarecrows. Their chests were split open, cavities stuffed with tangled roots that pulsed faintly in the lantern light. The roses above drank from them, drank deep, their roots wound through bone and muscle, drawing sustenance from what remained of the missing. The garden was not a garden at all. It was a graveyard, cultivated by hands that knew exactly what they were planting. One of the men dropped to his knees, clutching the earth. Elias, he choked, pulling at the soil until he revealed a familiar face, twisted, eyeless, but still recognizable. His mouth filled with mud and rain as he screamed. In that moment, the storm broke fully overhead. Thunder cracked, rain poured in sheets. And from the manor, faint through the downpour, a sound drifted across the gardens. A laugh. Low, melodic. A woman's laugh. The men froze, shovels clenched as the lanterns flickered. They could not see her, but they felt her, watching, smiling. Terrified, they fled, stumbling through the swamp, leaving the graves half open, the roses swaying above them as though satisfied. By dawn, the parish knew, not by the men's words, but by the roses themselves. For that morning, their blossoms were brighter than ever, blooming scarlet in the gray light, dripping with rain, and smelling not of flowers, but of blood. The truth could no longer be buried. Hollow Manor's garden was alive, and it was hungry. The men returned from the gardens broken, mud streaked up to their elbows, their faces pale with the weight of what they had unearthed. By dawn, the parish gathered in the churchyard, listening as the shaken voices tried to describe what lay beneath the roses. They did not need to say much. The stench of disturbed earth clung to their clothes, and the look in their eyes was enough to chill the marrow of every man and woman who heard them. The priest called it an abomination. The widow has defiled creation itself, he declared, his voice trembling. She has planted the dead like seeds. Mothers clutched their children close. Men tightened their grips on farm tools, muskets, knives. Even those who once defended Isolde Belleros now fell silent, unwilling to speak against the growing tide. By nightfall, a plan had taken root. They would storm Hollow Manor, not in whispers, not with shovels in the dark, but with the full force of the parish behind them. Torches, muskets, iron crosses, they would tear out the roses by their roots and drag the widow before the church to face judgment. But Hollow Manor had already been listening. That evening, before the men could gather, a glow rose over the swamp. Not the warm flicker of torches, but a steady burning light. Smoke curled through the cypress trees. The people rushed to the ridge, their hearts leaping, only to find it was not the manor ablaze. It was their own. The widow had struck first. One by one, the homes closest to Hollow Manor burned. Fire leapt from rooftops, sparks scattering into the black water. Families ran screaming into the marsh, clutching children, dragging what little they could carry. No one saw who set the fires. No one saw her hands upon the torch. But every tongue whispered the same name as the smoke rose into the night sky. Isolde Belleros. Through the haze of firelight, some swore they saw her standing at the gates of Hollow Manor. Her gown rippled in the heat, her pale face glowing as though carved from marble. She raised one hand as if blessing the chaos, before retreating into the shadows once more. Sheriff Verrett tried to rally the men, but his voice was drowned by the crack of collapsing timbers, the screams of livestock, the roar of flame. The parish, already trembling with fear, scattered further into panic. Families fled deeper into the bayou, abandoning the fight before it even began. By dawn, smoke still rose from the smoldering ruins. The church bells rang hollow, not for worship, but for mourning. And yet, in the ashes of the burned homes, the people found something strange. In each heap of blackened wood, roses had sprouted overnight. Their blossoms curled from the cinders, red as fresh blood, their roots reaching into the scorched earth as if drinking the last warmth of the fire. The widow had turned their tragedy into another garden, another grave. For the first time, the parish realized what they were up against. This was not a woman alone in her manor. This was something older, deeper, entwined with the swamp itself. And as the survivors huddled together, coughing smoke and whispering prayers, one question grew louder than the rest. How do you kill something that blooms from the dead? The parish had been broken by fire, but not destroyed. Out of the smoke and ruin, a small band emerged. Men and women both, stripped of homes, stripped of patience. They swore vengeance, not whispered now, but spoken aloud in voices that shook. Among them was Jacques Moreau, still haunted by what he had seen on the cellar table. His hands trembled constantly, but he held a musket tighter than he had ever held a plow. Beside him was Claire Carter, Elias's widow, her eyes hollow, her grief hardened into resolve. She carried not a weapon, but the wooden cross Elias had carved, blackened now from the fire. They set out at dusk, moving through the reeds in silence. The manor loomed larger with each step, its shutters closed tight, its chimneys coughing thin ribbons of smoke into the bruised sky. The gates stood open. They always stood open, as if Isolde invited the world to see what they dared not look upon. The band crossed the threshold, boots sinking into mud, hearts pounding against their ribs. Inside Hollow Manor was eerily still. The air was damp, heavy with the cloying perfume of roses. Every surface gleamed as though freshly polished, but the shine only made the shadows deeper. The chandeliers swayed though no breeze stirred. Jacques lifted his lantern, casting light across portraits on the walls. They were not of the Bellerose family, as one might expect, but of strangers. Dozens of strangers, men and women in traveling coats, work aprons, fine dresses, their eyes painted with uncanny detail, as if staring directly into the intruders' souls. One man swore he saw a painted face blink. He dropped his torch in terror, and the group pressed on quickly, unwilling to linger. They descended the cellar steps, the damp air curling around them like fingers. The wine racks loomed, but the band moved past them, searching for the wall where Verret had once heard the faint tapping. Jacques pressed his palm against the stone, and this time he felt it, a hollow echo beneath the surface. They brought their shovels down. Stone cracked, mortar crumbled, the wall gave way with a groan like the breath of something waking. Beyond was a passage, narrow and steep, the air colder than the swamp's heart. The group pressed forward, their lanterns flickering, and there it was, the inner chamber. It was vast, carved directly into the earth, its walls lined with niches. In each niche a body sat upright, pale, preserved, their lips sewn shut with black thread. The roots of roses wound through their ribs and skulls, sprouting blossoms that hung overhead like a canopy of red. At the chamber's center stood an altar of black stone. Upon it lay the remnants of a ritual, a silver chalice streaked with blood, a book bound in flesh, and scattered petals that looked as though they had been plucked from living hearts. Claire Carter fell to her knees, clutching Elias's cross to her chest. "God help us," she whispered. And then from the shadows came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. Isolde Bellerose emerged from the darkness, her gown trailing across the damp stone. Her eyes glowed faintly in the lantern light, her smile calm, serene, as though welcoming guests to a gathering. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "The roots are thirsty tonight." The lanterns flickered, the roses shivered, their blossoms trembling as if alive. And beneath the floor, the intruders swore they heard it, a heartbeat, slow, steady, echoing through the stone. The manor itself was breathing. The chamber's air grew thick, almost liquid, pressing into lungs, making each breath a desperate act. The intruders raised their weapons, muskets trembling, axes gripped tight, but it was as if the weight of the room itself drained their will. Isolde stepped toward the altar with a grace that belonged to another century. The silver chalice glimmered as she lifted it, its rim stained with a dark residue that smelled faintly of iron and roses. Her voice, when it came, was low and melodic, a chant in a tongue none of them knew. The syllables curled like smoke, seeping into their ears, into their bones. Claire Carter clutched Elias's cross higher, whispering prayers, but her voice shook too violently to be steady. Jacques tried to raise his musket, but his arms felt pinned by unseen hands. The others shifted nervously, their courage unraveling like thread. Then, with a flick of her hand, Isolde beckoned one of them forward. It was young René Lavigne, barely more than a boy. Drawn by some invisible pull, his eyes wide, his mouth slack, he stumbled toward her as if sleepwalking. The others shouted, reaching to stop him, but their feet felt stuck in mud. Isolde's smile widened. She set the chalice upon the altar and placed her palm against Rene's chest. Her long fingers pressed into him with a shocking tenderness, like a mother steadying a child. And then she pushed. Her hand sank into his flesh as though it were water. Rene convulsed, his eyes rolling back, a strangled cry caught in his throat. Blood welled around Isolde's wrist, yet she showed no strain. She withdrew slowly, holding something that pulsed faintly in her hand, a heart, glistening, still beating. Gasps and screams erupted, echoing against the stone. Claire sobbed openly, Jacques vomited against the wall. The others shouted prayers or curses, their voices rising into chaos. Isolde lifted the heart high, and the roses above her bent downward as if reaching to drink. The petals opened wider, unnaturally wide, and dripped crimson dew. She squeezed and the heart burst, its blood raining down into the chalice below. The chamber trembled, the heartbeat in the stone grew louder, faster. The bodies in the niches stirred, their stitched mouths quivering as though begging to scream. Rene's body collapsed to the floor, empty, his eyes staring into nothingness. Isolde turned back to the intruders, her voice calm as a lullaby. The soil must be fed, or everything withers. You've brought me such generous offerings. Jocas screamed and finally fired his musket. The blast thundered in the chamber, the smoke thick. When it cleared, Isolde stood untouched, smiling. The ball had struck her chest but left no wound. She stepped closer. The roses crept down the walls like serpents, curling toward the intruders, thorns glistening like wet teeth. Now, she whispered, it is your turn. The lanterns extinguished, plunging them into blackness. In the dark, screams rose, ragged, desperate, and were cut short one by one. But not all would die in that chamber. One would escape. One would carry the story out of Hollow Manor. And that survivor's account would haunt the parish for generations. When the lanterns died and the chamber drowned in black, the screams were not all equal. Some ended with a sudden choke, as if a throat had been sealed shut. Others dragged on, shrill, desperate, dissolving into wet gurgles. And yet amidst the chaos, there was movement, a single figure staggering blindly, guided by instinct more than sight. Jacques Moreau. The musket had fallen from his grasp, his lantern shattered. He crawled along the stone floor, hands scraping against the damp earth, slipping on blood that was not his own. Around him the roses rustled, their thorns whispering across the stone like knives unsheathed. He whispered Elias's name, Claire's name, Rene's name, but no voice answered back. Only the echo of Isolde's chant, soft, steady, as if she had no need to raise her voice to be heard. And then a crack of light. It was faint, spilling through the jagged hole they had broken in the cellar wall. Jacques lunged for it. A thorn tore across his face, slicing skin, blinding his left eye with blood, but he did not stop. He hurled himself through the opening, scraping shoulders raw, and clawed his way up the cellar stairs. Behind him, the chamber trembled. He could hear the roses shifting, the heartbeat of the earth growing louder, following. He burst into the Manor's dining hall, where silverware still gleamed on the long table, where decanters of wine stood untouched, as if a feast waited for guests who would never arrive. The portraits on the walls seemed to lean forward, eyes narrowing, lips twitching. Jacques swore one of them, the likeness of Elias Carter, newly painted, turned its gaze directly upon him, but he did not stop. He stumbled through the front doors into the swamp night, where the mist clung low, where frogs croaked and fireflies blinked in time with his hammering pulse. His boots splashed through muck, his breath tearing from his throat in ragged sobs. He did not look back, not at the manor, not at the glow that now pulsed in its windows as if the house itself had veins. Hours later, broken and fevered, Jacques collapsed on the steps of the parish church. His clothes were shredded, his skin clawed raw, his eye ruined. The priest and a few surviving parishioners found him at dawn, muttering incoherently about roses that drank blood, about a widow who fed the soil with hearts. Some believed him, others said he had gone mad in the fire. But no one could deny the fresh scar across his face, the terror in his voice when he cried out that she had not finished feeding. Because in his delirium, Jacques claimed he had heard Isolde's final words before he escaped. They will return to me. All roots return. And in the nights that followed, more began to vanish. One here, two there, quiet disappearances, as if the swamp had swallowed them whole. And every time the parish lit lanterns to search the reeds, a faint glow was seen in the distance. The windows of Hollow Manor, breathing in the fog. The nights after Jacques' escape grew longer, heavier. The swamp air seemed thicker, clinging to skin like oil. People swore they could hear voices in the mist, not whispers carried by the reeds, but distinct words calling them by name. Children cried that they saw pale figures moving at the tree line, their mouths sewn shut, roses growing from their eyes. One by one, parishioners began to vanish. A fisherman never returned from his boat. A seamstress left her home at midnight and was never seen again. A family of 4 abandoned their cabin entirely, doors left open, stew still steaming on the hearth. The pattern was unmistakable. Always at night, always near the waters that fed the Bellerose estate. Jacques, recovering in the parish rectory, begged the priest to act. His ruined eye twitched whenever he spoke of her. "She isn't contained," he rasped. "She doesn't need us to go to her anymore. The roots are here, Father. They're beneath our feet." The priest listened but said nothing, for even he, in the quiet hours, had begun to notice a strange creeping ivy crawling up the church walls. Its leaves were dark, its blossoms red, and no matter how many times he tore it down, it grew back by dawn. Soon the swamp itself seemed to pulse. Frogs croaked in rhythms that mimicked heartbeats. Fireflies flickered in unison, forming patterns that looked like words. Hunters reported seeing blood seeping from tree trunks, as if the forest itself were wounded. And in the distance the manor glowed brighter. Some swore they could see figures gathering in its windows, not guests, not servants, but the very people who had vanished from their beds. They stood motionless, their faces pale and distant, their eyes blooming red with roses. By then the parish was unraveling. Families packed wagons in the dead of night, abandoning homes built across generations. Others locked themselves indoors, nailing shutters shut, but even then the smell of roses seeped through the cracks. Claire Carter, widowed and alone, refused to leave. She carried Elias's cross everywhere, whispering that God had not abandoned them, though her voice betrayed doubt. One night she returned to the cemetery to pray. She found roses sprouting from Elias's grave, thick, wet, the soil pulsing as though it were not earth but flesh. When she touched a blossom, it pricked her finger. Blood welled instantly, and the petals drank it greedily, darkening to a deeper crimson. She fled, clutching her bleeding hand, whispering through sobs that Elias's soul was not at rest. By now, the manor was not just a place of fear, it was a presence, an infection, a hunger, and the whispers in the parish grew louder, that Isolde Bellerose had made a pact with something older than the swamp itself, that she was no longer merely human, but a vessel for roots that spread without end. The question was no longer whether the manor would claim more lives, it was how many, and whether anyone could stop her. By autumn, the parish no longer resembled itself. The swamp had taken on a fevered life. Vines thick as arms twisted around cabins. Wells bubbled with red-tinged water, and the cries of unseen children carried on the fog at night. It was said that Hollow Manor's windows never went dark, no matter the hour, as though lit by some eternal, pulsing fire. The exodus had left only a fraction of families behind. Those who stayed did so either out of stubborn faith or because fear had bound them in place, too paralyzed to abandon the graves of their kin. But the disappearances did not stop. They only became bolder. Doors were found open at dawn, bedding torn, muddy footprints leading back toward the direction of the manor. It was Jacques Moreau, scarred and fevered, who gathered what remained of the parish in the gutted shell of the church. His ruined eye gleamed in the candlelight, the wound still red and angry, but his voice no longer trembled. "She feeds because we let her," he said hoarsely, gripping the pulpit as though it held him upright. "We offer her silence. We offer her fear. But roots can be cut. Fires can consume. We end her now, or none of us will see the spring." The room murmured, some nodding, others weeping. A farmer spat on the floor, muttering that Bellerose's curse was older than any of them and could not be undone. But Claire Carter rose, holding Elias's blackened cross in both hands. "I saw his grave bleed," she whispered. "If we do nothing, even the dead won't belong to God anymore." Her voice steadied. "We end it tonight." And so, they agreed. A plan, desperate and crude, was drawn. They would march upon Hollow Manor, under cover of night, bearing torches, axes, and iron from the church bell that had fallen in the fire. They whispered that iron, holy and unyielding, could break whatever pact Isolde had bound herself to. The priest, pale and trembling, offered each of them a blessing. Yet as he raised the last hand in prayer, the candles sputtered. A single rose petal drifted from the rafters onto the altar. Red, fresh, no roses had ever grown inside the church. Fear rippled through the crowd, but Jacques barked. "It is proof she fears us. She knows we are coming." At dusk they gathered, men and women both, torches flaring in the swamp mist. The procession moved slowly, their voices hushed, though the swamp itself seemed to watch. Every ripple on the water, every croak, every rustle in the reeds felt like a warning. When the manor finally appeared through the fog, it looked larger than before, its gables jagged against the bruised sky, its windows glowing as though alive. Some whispered that it was breathing, others that the light in its windows was not fire but eyes. Still they pressed forward. Claire clutched Elias's cross until her knuckles split. Jock carried a jug of oil slung at his hip. Farmers hefted axes. Mothers clutched blades meant for slaughtering pigs. All of them felt the throb of the swamp beneath their boots, each step sinking with a heartbeat not their own. And from somewhere deep inside Hollow Manor, a soft melody drifted out. A woman's voice, low and serene. Isolde was singing. The parishioners crossed the threshold of Hollow Manor, as though stepping into the belly of some colossal beast. Their torches hissed in the damp air, casting long quivering shadows across polished wood and velvet curtains that seemed to pulse like living flesh. The singing ceased. In its place came silence, the kind so thick it presses against the ears until one hears only the rush of blood in the skull. Claire Carter whispered a prayer under her breath, her voice thin against the suffocating quiet. Jacques lifted his jug of oil and poured a dark trail across the entrance hall, striking a flint to spark flame. The fire took eagerly, crawling along the boards, but as it spread, the torches sputtered. The walls seemed to drink the fire in, swallowing it like thirsting roots. "Forward," Jacques hissed. His voice was hoarse but certain. "The cellar, that's where she feeds." The group moved deeper, passing portraits that now seemed warped, as if the paint itself writhed. Faces shifted, eyes following, mouths stretching into silent screams. One woman swung her axe at a frame, splitting canvas down the middle. A black liquid seeped from the tear, running like blood. By the time they reached the cellar door, half of them were already wavering, muttering that they had walked willingly into damnation. But Jacques forced it open. The stench rose instantly, damp roses and rotting flesh. They descended. At the chamber below they found her. Isolde Bellarose stood at the altar, her gown trailing across the stone, her hair loose and gleaming as though kissed by moonlight. Her hands were raised, palms open, and before her knelt three figures, parishioners who had vanished weeks prior. Their eyes glowed faintly red, their lips sewn shut with black thread. "You should not have come," Isolde said softly, her voice carrying without force as though the walls themselves spoke with her. "I had given you mercy, distance, but now you return, and the soil must drink again." Jacques lifted his musket, aimed and fired. The blast roared, smoke choking the chamber. When it cleared, Isolde still stood, untouched, smiling. The parish roared back, surging forward with axes and torches. The air erupted in chaos. A mother slammed her torch into the altar, and flames licked across its surface, but the roses above bent downward, smothering the fire with their petals, drinking it like water. Isolde moved among them like mist, never quite where the eye expected, her hands brushing across faces and leaving trails of blackened skin. One man screamed as his flesh cracked like dry earth, roots bursting from his veins. Still, the parish fought on. Jacques hurled the rest of his oil across the chamber wall, flames catching this time in a violent rush. The chamber screamed not Isolde, but the walls themselves, as though the house felt pain. Claire raised Elias's cross high, shouting prayers. For a moment the stitch-mouthed thralls faltered, twitching violently, their sewn lips tearing as muffled wails escaped. But then came the betrayal. From the back of the group, one of their own turned. A farmer named Duval, who had spoken little all night, now dropped his torch and fell to his knees before Isolde. Tears streamed down his face. "She promised me, my boy," he sobbed. "He died in the fever, but she promised I'd see him again." Isolde's hand caressed his hair with tender grace. She leaned close and whispered something none of the others could hear. Then, without hesitation, Duval drove his blade into the belly of the woman beside him. Screams tore through the chamber. Chaos split the band apart, and above it all, Isolde's calm voice whispered like a lullaby, "All roots return." The chamber had become a storm of fire and screams. The walls bled smoke. The roses shrieked as their petals curled and blackened. And yet Isolde stood serene, as if the chaos itself were her hymn. Jacques Moreau, half blind and staggering, seized Claire Carter's arm. "Now," he shouted, dragging her toward the altar. His musket was gone, his body failing, but the iron cross in her hand still gleamed, untouched by soot. Together they charged. Isolde turned slowly, almost with pity, her pale face luminous in the firelight. "You cannot cut the root," she whispered. "You cannot starve the soil." Claire raised the cross high and drove it into Isolde's chest. For the first time the widow screamed. The sound was not human. It was the wail of the swamp itself. Frogs croaking in agony, reeds bending as if against a storm, the very heartbeat of the earth stuttering. Flames surged higher, devouring roses that withered to ash, walls buckling as though the manor were collapsing inward. Isolde staggered, her hands clutching the cross buried in her flesh. Her eyes, once serene, now blazed red. She reached for Claire, but Jacques threw himself between them. The roots caught him instantly, curling around his legs, his arms, dragging him down. His final words, choked through blood, were "burn it all." Claire wrenched the cross deeper. The altar cracked in two, and a gush of blood, black, hot, endless, poured forth, drowning the floor. The stitch-mouthed thralls fell limp, their bodies crumbling into dust. The ceiling groaned, beams split, the fire roared. Claire fled, stumbling up the cellar stairs, through the collapsing hall, past portraits that screamed in oil and canvas. She burst into the night as the manor behind her erupted in flame. The others, those who still lived, ran too, their faces lit in red by the inferno. They did not look back, not until the roof caved in with a thunderous roar, sending sparks into the swamp sky like stars torn from heaven. By dawn, Hollow Manor was a smoldering skeleton. The swamp steamed, and the air stank of blood and roses. No body of Isolde Bellerose was ever found among the ruins. Claire, shaken and hollow-eyed, swore that as the house collapsed, she heard one last whisper rising with the smoke. All roots return. In the months that followed, the parish dissolved. Survivors scattered to other towns, carrying only hushed warnings. The swamp slowly swallowed what remained of Hollow Manor, vines growing over blackened stone, water filling the cellar where so much blood had been spilled. And yet, travelers who pass near its ruins still speak of strange things. At night, a faint glow lingers among the trees, as if windows burn with unseen fire. The smell of roses clings thick in the fog, though no roses grow there. And some swear that if you kneel by the water's edge, you can hear it, a slow, steady heartbeat beneath the soil. They say Isolde never died that night. They say she waits, patient as roots, for the parish to return to her. What do you believe? Because some whispers claim her spirit still lingers, a widow with roses in her hair, watching from the swamp mist, waiting for strangers to step too close to her ruined gates. And those who do are never seen again. Some say she died that night. Others say her spirit still haunts the swamp. What do you believe? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you dare.